Okay, I think we're good now.
This is just an audio recorder in case something happens with the camera. So,
All right.
Yeah.
photos to you.
Yeah.
How's it look?
It looks nice. You're not in the shot, so we're good.
All right. Well, our names are Abigail Vincent and Elizabeth Berenick. We are interviewing you for the IUP COVID-19 Oral History Project. We are interested in learning about people's experiences during the pandemic. Today's date is Friday, February 17th. Would you please begin by introducing yourself and spelling your name for us?
No problem. My name is Valerie Baroni, Valerie, B as in boy, Aroni. I'm the Director of Housing and Dining here at IUP.
For the purpose of the interview, would you be willing to share your full name, age, where you were living, and how did your personal and/or professional priorities and projects that you were working on change when the pandemic hit?
No problem. So again, I'm Valerie Baroni. I live here in Indiana County. I live just a little bit off campus on Grant Street. I am 40 years old. And my title now is the same as my title pre-pandemic in terms of working with housing and dining here on campus. Since the pandemic, I've also taken over kind of the residence life component of our office as well, but that is still part of housing.
What were your responsibilities at the university before the pandemic started, and what did the average day look like?
So when you work with students, every day is a little bit different. So I can't say that I have an average day. Most of my average day is generally problem solving in some way, shape, or form. It's really dependent on student needs and by association, their parent or family needs. But most of my day is there's some type of customer service involved. There's some type of budgetary work, some type of data management, some type of facilities concerns, supervision, staff development. It's a whole wide range, anything that could pertain to living or eating here on campus.
You received this list of questions before the interview. Is there anywhere specific you'd like to start?
No.
What would you like us to know first about your experience during the pandemic?
I think the main thing is really just the importance that being flexible and problem solving at kind of the last minute played and had to play. So much of it happened so quickly. We were on spring break when the university made the decision to extend spring break. Well, within a few days we would have had 2,500 students returning to campus, right? And so making adjustments and finding ways to communicate with them kind of at the last minute to first extend the spring break, make arrangements so that they could come back if they had to come back, but also making sure they knew that the university was extending spring break. And then shortly after that, the decision to send everybody home was made. And so coordinating the move out mid-semester of 22 or 2,300. We still had students that needed to stay here. We never stopped housing or feeding people. And we were one of the few universities in the area that still had students on campus and was still running dining because we had 100 people that were eating every day still. And then just kind of figuring out that flexibility that was needed as it came. Like our first students we had to put in to quarantine on campus was the week after spring break, right? Like they all ended up testing negative, but at that time so much was unknown, and a friend of theirs had had an exposure that this was when everything just shut down. And so just figuring out minute by minute what needed to get done, how it needed to get done, and how we could do it really played a huge role.
Are there any artifacts about your experience during COVID-19 that you would like to share or talk about? This could be like an article of clothing or document, your favorite mask or an object or a photograph.
I don't have any documents or anything like that. A lot of our work with COVID has been pertaining to isolation housing. And we are still running isolation housing. So a lot of the things that we've used for that are either things that are intentionally disposable or are electronically based, right? So using Grubhub so that we can deliver meals to students in isolation, and so that students have a choice of what they're going to eat as opposed to having something set and prescribed to them. That's all virtual. Finding a reliable source for disposable bedding. So disposable sheets, disposable pillows, towels that we can then throw away. The sheer fact that students don't want to use body wash to wash their hands, they have to have hand soap. So a lot of those things are things that we would use or consider to be supplies, but aren't necessarily a single tangible artifact or anything like that.
You've already kind of mentioned this, but in what ways has the pandemic impacted your work? Is there anything else you'd like to add?
So a lot of it was spur of the moment, right? And figuring out how best to communicate things and how to still be there in a customer service, student development way for the students we still had. And for the students we had that following fall who came their freshman year to classrooms that were socially distanced and wearing masks and not a lot of in-person activities happening, and how we could still connect with them and be there for them when they were facing such high levels of isolation. And I've forgotten part of your question. Could you repeat it?
No, I think you've answered most of it. It's just, in what ways has the pandemic impacted your work? But also, how have things changed now that we're returning to more normal activities?
You see more students out and about outside of class times, thankfully. People are interacting more. So much of what we do in the halls is we try to build connections with people, and we try to be there. There was so much fear, especially that first year. And so, and that went everywhere, right? So my staff responds to emergencies that happen in rooms, in student rooms in the middle of the night. So conversations about how we can best keep them safe. That's not as much of a concern now as it was fall 20. Yes, fall of 20. In some ways it feels like yesterday and it feels like forever ago. For the first 2 months of the fall semester of fall 20, I delivered every meal to every student in isolation because my staff were scared, right? And so now people are like, oh, we have a much better idea how COVID's transmitted. There's vaccines and then boosters. My staff that respond to emergencies were on the initial list of emergency responders for Indiana County that could get the first vaccine when it came out. And I had staff members crying to me because they weren't on that list, right? And begging me to put their name on that list, even though they didn't serve in that first responder role. And so those types of personal safety concerns, not only for the students we serve, but also the staff I supervise, aren't as much in the everyday life or the forefront of people's mind now as they were then. I have students hanging out outside, right? People in study lounges. People aren't as freaked out to be in an elevator with someone else. We're here in this room without masks. Mm-hmm. I still have some staff that wear masks every day because of personal situations at home or anything like that. But it's not everybody. I can have an in-person meeting. And it makes a huge difference when you work with people.
I'm just curious, you mentioned that you had to deliver all these meals. How many students was that every day, and what kind of protocol did you have to follow, or both parties have to follow when you were delivering those meals?
So it changed a little bit as things went on. So like the very first meals we delivered were that week that we shut down. And those were some folks who had had a close contact, because at that time we were isolating close contacts because we didn't know as much about how it was spread. And so we had on masks and face shields and gloves, and like a disposable hospital gown type thing. And we would knock and put it like right at the entryway to their door, and then step back. And they had to come to their door of their room wearing a mask. And from a distance, we would like say, "Are you okay? Do you need anything? You have our email." And then, you know, hand sanitizing before and hand sanitizing after. Everything we sent into the room was on disposables. Until like that evolved into isolation housing, which is still pretty similar to what it is now. And so at the start of that fall, we had already learned by then a good bit about how things were transmitted. But it was double masks, right? So KN95 mask and another mask on top of that. At the very beginning of that semester, there was some face masks and gloves, hand sanitizer. The biggest change in kind of that safety was we were letting rooms sit for a week after someone had used it to make sure there was no virus on any surfaces. And then we would go into it with, our custodial folks would go in with a electrostatic sprayer full of like a disinfectant type thing for the air. And so that would cover every surface, and then 2 days later they would go in and clean. To kind of like now, anytime a student came to the door, they had to have a mask on, right? We provided the masks, we gave them all that stuff. A whole lot of reminding folks, get back in your room and put your mask on. Right? You are actively contagious. Put your mask on. And now it's hand sanitizer, wear a mask, right? Don't get up close to that person. But our procedures and protocols have changed so much as we learned so much over the course of it.
The isolation housing, I was just going to ask, the isolation housing, was that in a separate building or was that in students' individual dorms? What did that look like?
So it was in a separate wing of the building. At our highest point, we had 27 students in there at the same time. I'm thankful it never went higher than that at the same time, but we've cycled through hundreds in a semester. Just because at the start, it was students would have to be in there for 10 days, and then students would have to be in there for 5 days past the point of their first symptoms. So thankfully, now it is not as long, but after 10 days, you get a little annoyed with the same folks, right? Especially when they always forget to put isolation mail in the Grubhub order. And so it was in a separate wing of a residence hall because our buildings are designed in such a way that each wing has its own air handler. And so the way our air handlers work is they cycle clean air in, and there's a separate part of the system that cycles the old air out of a room, right? So there's no crossing of that within a wing. And so we were able to use the other half of the building to continue to house people without necessarily worrying as much about cross-contamination or anything like that, because that wing, all 4 floors, was set aside for students that had close contacts, tested positive, or waiting on positive results, but had all the symptoms, all of those things, as that point in the pandemic told us, they needed to be isolated by.
Shifting gears a little bit, how did the lockdown impact your work-life balance?
It really did not do great things for it at first, right? So again, we always had people here. So that first month, the days were longer. I was probably spending 12 to 15 hours on campus a day, most days of the week, just because things needed to get done. And in some ways, it's always easier to do them yourself than try to make someone work beyond fears that they may have, right? Especially at the beginning when we didn't know so much. And so, truly, like I said, like I was the only one delivering meals for the first few months. And then our vice president of student affairs, Dr. Seeger, he assisted some days. And then Malika Turner, who's our assistant vice president for student affairs, also started helping. And so from there, it kind of opened it up a little bit to people like, oh, okay, so like leadership is doing this. It kind of helped, I guess, normalize it a little bit. And then we eventually evolved that into a student worker position, where they had to go through some online courses pertaining to COVID safety and things along those lines, and some very strict training by our health center and by our folks. And so they were able to then assist us with this.
Is that still a position, or has that gone away?
I'm still running isolation housing. Knock on wood. I do not have anyone in there today. I did earlier this week.
Abby, can I add a question in? Okay. With the isolation housing for COVID-19, do you think that will continue to be a thing on like a campus as we move off of COVID, just in general as a medical thing?
So in housing, we have always, going back decades, we've always had quarantine spaces. They were always intended for like chicken pox and things along those lines. We more often than not use them for emergency room changes for roommate conflicts that happened in the middle of the night, right? And so we've always had at least 2 quarantine spaces on campus. Now we've got a few hundred, or a few dozen, not a few hundred. It will probably take on a new evolution as COVID becomes more integrated into our everyday lives. So it will probably take on a new evolution, but we will always continue offering that quarantine isolation type option. It's just we may eventually get to the point where we're not delivering meals, or we're not providing you with disposable bedding so that you're not taking your germy bedding back to your room, right? Even though some students would take their full-size TVs with them into isolation. There were some students who almost essentially moved their entire room in with them during isolation. So we will always offer that emergency type of option. It just might have a different format depending on the needs of campus at that given time.
What work changes or impacts resulting from the pandemic have you most enjoyed or disliked?
I am so tired of isolation housing. Some students have very much been babied when they have been sick at home, right? And some students have had the opposite experience, right? It varies widely depending on your home situation and how you were raised. Sometimes it will take me 13 communications with a student, like through email or calling, just to get them to understand, like, I need you to order your food during this time frame. Right? Like, no. Where did you order from? Delaney. No, you're in Delaney. Where did you order your food from? I got pizza. And then other times really just making me realize how much clearer our communications need to be in terms of some instructions and things along those lines, right? I had a student this semester email me and say, what do I do after my food is delivered? And I'm like, okay, my initial reaction is to say you eat it. what are they actually asking, right? And they were asking something entirely different, but I had to take that moment and say, okay, what could they actually be asking? Because they're not asking me like, do I then eat the food? And it's been high needs at times, right? So if there's 27 people in isolation housing, that means 27 lunch orders that all have to get sent over to dining at 11:30 a.m. so that they can be delivered to the building at 1 p.m. so that they can be hand delivered to each room. All hopefully while the food is still warm, right? And while doing other things, while making sure so-and-so has cough drops, or if they ran out of toilet paper. It's a lot more basic needs-based than a lot of the housing services we provide on a daily basis, because our students can go to Walmart and get those things for themselves. Whereas our students in isolation are trapped in isolation. Trapped, right? Like, we tell you not to leave the hallway door. And so it's a higher level of service in that basic needs level than is sustainable for a very long period of time.
Are there any impacts that you think are positive that you've enjoyed that have come from the pandemic?
I myself have had many fewer issues of bronchitis and things along those lines, because we're so much more used to social distancing now, and I think people are more willing to take the time off if they are sick. So on a personal level, I am sick so much less frequently, which I appreciate. And I think in some ways, students are, as a whole, more courteous of others being sick. And so I think that's an overall benefit to our campus population.
How do you think the pandemic impacted IUP and IUP's relationship with the community?
I mean, in IUP, it changed so many things. It changed how we held meetings. It changed what campus looked like and sounded like and how it operated. And it's changing back in a lot of ways, but there are other things that are still permanent. Grubhub, we were only just kind of introducing before the pandemic. Now I think that's the only way some of my students order food, right? The demand for private bedrooms and completely private suites has grown exponentially since the pandemic. 15 years ago, I only had 8 completely private rooms, suites on campus. Now I have over 300, right? And so how students viewed their need for privacy, I think, was greatly impacted. Like, we had been moving that way a little bit before, but once COVID hit, it was like a huge shift in that sense. So those are probably 2 of the biggest ways in terms of eating and in housing. And in the community, I think initially there was a lot of distrust of college students returning and college students being a huge vector for infection, even though how often are our college students within 6 feet of a townie, right? Like that type of thing. But at that beginning, there was a lot of fear associated with that.
Now that life has somewhat returned to normal, how have your priorities, projects, and job responsibilities evolved?
I work with people, and I work with people around basic needs, so housing and dining. So my job will always be whatever meets people's needs at that given point in time. And people are always changing with or without a pandemic. So I kind of mentioned like the need for completely private spaces growing. How there's some folks who only order over Grubhub. I know of at least one student who is a junior, and I don't think she's ever sat down to eat in the dining hall, right? Because that fear, because of her health concerns, is still pretty paramount for her. And so keeping in mind those aspects are still very much in the forefront for people, while still offering opportunities for students to gather, for them to have events in person. When we did late night pancakes in person for the first time post-pandemic, it was a big decision, right? Because we get 700-800 people for pancakes, late night pancakes. And really just kind of quelling our own worries and anxieties and making sure we could do it in a way that was safe but still offered that opportunity for students. So things like that aren't as heightened, but they're still very much there for some people. So kind of trying to keep that balance.
How has the pandemic affected your life?
I worked a lot before the pandemic. I worked a lot during the pandemic. Again, it kind of goes towards that immediacy of human needs and changing to meet the needs of our students.
When, if ever, did the pandemic first feel real to you?
It felt very real as we were closing down campus after spring break, because move out is normally a bit more chaotic than move in, right? Students are never as packed as their families want them to be, and they've always accrued more stuff than reasonably fits into a vehicle to go home. And so there's always that additional chaos bit. But students had no time to prepare, right? And then there was very little information at the time as to how contagious this was in a setting, because at that point the pandemic was hitting parts of New York and parts of major cities, but it hadn't really hit here, right? Like, we isolated people, but they had never actually tested positive, right? And so that unknown, that worry piece, was very much real.
How did the pandemic affect your perspective, your attitude about the community, employment, economics, society, anything like that you want to share?
I think in general, there's a lot of ways that folks have lost patience in interacting with other people, right? Where some of those cultural norms they bring with them from home. Once upon a time, there was a little bit more of a willingness to compromise on a grander scale with another person, especially in a living situation, right? But I think the pandemic firmed up a lot of people's boundaries and removed some of that willingness to compromise. So in Hall, we often see that in roommate conflicts that go from 0 to 90 over a Pop-Tart, right? Whereas before, we might have been able to help them communicate that a little bit differently, like, hey, you can snack on this food of mine, but my Pop-Tarts are off limit. They spent so much time isolated within their family groups that they never had to learn to have those conversations, right? Because most of our students' high school years were spent by themselves or with their families. In a lot of ways, they've never had to say, I'm really not comfortable if you take my stuff, right? And so they'll resort to things online or passive-aggressive Post-it notes. And so we've always done room changes pretty openly for people. This semester we did over 60 in the first 2 weeks of the spring semester, which is a lot. And so I think it's changed that aspect of our society, but I don't know if that's still because we're so close to the pandemic, or if that's a long-term effect.
What impact did the pandemic have on your personal and or professional relationships?
I've always been a person with a healthy personal space bubble. And a large part of my job is talking to people and customer service and helping them work through things. So in that aspect, I can't say that it's affected much. I think in my meetings with colleagues, I have to be a lot more intentional about connecting with them because not as many meetings are in person. And so when you're doing meetings online, you miss that casual, like, joking around before the meeting or after the meeting. And so it's very easy to just relegate a conversation with a colleague to that business level, get things done. But the personal aspect is just as important for my work colleagues as it is for my students. And so being intentional about that, like I said, I myself have been healthier. So I'm pretty cool with that. And I think it also, I've got a pretty big family. Like, I've got 8 nieces and nephews. I did not see them for over a year, which is really weird. And so we had to find ways to connect that weren't our getting together in person. And so a stupid thing that has stuck with me is, like, the Nintendo Switch and playing games with them online. Like, just stupid little things like that. But were, for months, really my only connection to my family. And so weird things like that. I'm now attached to my Nintendo Switch.
What games did you play with them? Do you remember any of them?
They love Human Fall Flat. It drives me crazy. The first 5 minutes is just them trying to throw me off a cliff. We can amicably play Animal Crossing and Mario Kart and those types of games without a problem. But their persistence in wanting to play Human Fall Flat drives me a tiny bit crazy because I just don't get it. I don't understand how the person moves, and then they just want to throw me off a cliff.
Do you still play any of those games with them, or has that?
No,
have you said
still
no?
play those games.
Oh, okay.
If you want to spend the first 5 minutes just dragging my character off the cliff, knock yourself out. But, it's been a few years now. They're also a little older, so, like, we can talk about Zelda and, like, other games like that. But they still get such a kick out of those things. And if it's going to make them laugh like that to throw me off the cliff, I'll be fine.
In what ways do you think your experience relating to the pandemic has been similar or different compared to other people's experiences?
Well, I think that aspect of online connection was huge for people. As well as, like, the sense of fear and helping people work through things. I mean, society itself changed. And so I am somewhat lucky in the fact that I've always been within a drivable distance to my family. And even though I could not really see them for a year or interact with them for a year because I was delivering meals and had all these exposures and things along those lines, that ability to connect somehow with people was really important.
That kind of leads into the next question. What are some of the things that you felt you missed out on during the pandemic?
It was, in a lot of aspects, that human connection. I live alone. I have pets. I have a huge extended family that I spend a lot of time with, and that disappeared with the pandemic. My family itself changed as a result. And I saw some of my aunts for the first time this past year because of various health issues they had and things like that. And the fact that I will always have to go into isolation housing in some way, shape, or form. I use hand sanitizer, I wear masks, all of those things. I vaccinated, they're vaccinated. But there's always that risk. And so it changed our family dynamic. We no longer have 30% Thanksgivings or 40% Thanksgivings. We now have 10% Thanksgivings, which is fine, but there's always people missing.
How did the pandemic impact the way you enjoy or engage with the world?
I started playing video games again after a couple of decades, and interacting with folks that way. I had maybe been part of 24 Zoom meetings pre-pandemic. Now I'm showing people how to actually log into Zoom and put it on their computer and things along those lines. That use of technology aspect and it becoming more integrated into folks' everyday work lives, I think was a huge aspect. And then that people self-isolating when ill, isolation type thing, being more conscious of, I have germs, and these germs could go to you, I think had a big change or impact on people.
In your opinion, how has IUP or the Indiana community changed because of the pandemic?
I think in a lot of ways IUP became more flexible to student needs, to the workforce needs. The county I can't really speak to too much because so much of my life revolves around this campus. So I don't know county-wise. As for IUP, I think that flexibility was a huge aspect.
How did the pandemic affect the activities you like to do prior to the lockdown?
It took me, this past winter, I went and saw my first musical. I used to have like season tickets to things in Pittsburgh. I just started to get back into those things a little bit. And I'm still cautious around crowds and things like that, but I never really liked crowds.